This is part 2 of making my Nadja cosplay. In the last video we went over making the corset, but there is one more thing we need to do before we actually get to start on the main dress, and that is making a petticoat. So the pattern that I used for the petticoat is the TV 170 from Truly Victorian. So it comes with 2 looks. One that has a more flat front and the other that has a like ruffly front right here. So it has the gathered edge down there and this one doesn't. So this is actually the one that I used. It's a little bit more, it's a little closer to the actual time period because this is for a later Victorian look. And that was the look I wanted for this project. I hope y'all like gathering because this project was mostly gathering. I don't like gathering. Essentially, this project is 3 big circles. So the first circle goes from the waist to about the roughly above the knee. And so the first one, the front of it gets darted down, so it's like a nice flat front. And then the back of it gets super gathered into the waistband to give a little oomph in the back for maximum poof for the long wide skirts of this period. Then this section is about twice as big as the hem of the first loop, and it gets gathered down, and usually you do some tucks here and it's really pretty, and you can use that to adjust the length of the petticoat. And then the final tier is the ruffle, and so it's about twice as big as the second loop, and it gets gathered down for maximum poof. And so this is about right below the knee to like mid-calf. This is about mid-calf to ankles or just above the ankles, because you don't want this to hit the floor because then you could see it under your skirts and it's like it's not cute. Apparently I didn't buy enough fabric for this project. I thought I did, and then I washed it and just wasn't quite enough. So unfortunately I couldn't do the pretty little pin tucks on there. Luckily I had enough fabric to get the right length of it, but that was because I couldn't do the pin tucks. And instead I just like lengthened the ruffle a little bit with some lace I had in my collection, and then it just turned out fine.
The main fabric is a super light cotton batiste. I used a 1/4 of an inch gold ribbon for trim. I used a 1-inch ribbon from my stash for the drawstring. And of course, thread. After printing, taping together, and cutting out the Truly Victorian PDF pattern, it was time to cut the fabric. I just drew directly onto the fabric with a pencil. Truly Victorian patterns come with a 1/2 inch seam allowance already built in, so I didn't need to add that. You can see where I end up cutting the middle tier pieces in half to make up for the lack of fabric. Once I cut everything out, I serged all of the pieces. I started with the first tier. First, I added the darts to the front of the petticoat. And then I sewed together the front, sides, and backs, leaving a gap in the center back to make it easier to get into. I then finished the seams of the petticoat by felling them down. I knew at this point that I wanted to finish the seams of the main dress by felling, and I thought the petticoat would be a good opportunity to practice this skill. I then folded over the edges of the waistband so that it would be a nice clean edge. I then sewed a large running stitch in the seam allowance of the back pieces of the first tier. The gathers kept trying to move and mess up and slide out of place, so I did a quick little basting stitch to keep the gathers in place before I attached the waistband to the first tier. I then just machine stitched the waistband on. And then I just folded it over and did a stitch on the ditch to attach the other side. Now the first tier is done and we can move on to the second tier. First, I stitched together the seams of all the second tier pieces to make a giant circle. I then went and sewed a running stitch in the seam allowance on the top of the second tier to gather it. I think I was having some tension issues with my machine at the time, which is why I'm gathering by hand here. I gave each panel its own running stitch instead of making one giant one, because that way if a thread broke, I would only have to redo one panel instead of the whole thing. Once every panel had a running stitch, I gathered the panels by pulling the gathering threads into the bottom edge of the first tier and pinning them in place. This involves a lot of sliding the fabric along the gathers, measuring, remeasuring, pinning, and repinning. It can be really easy to accidentally have sections that are really gathered down or sections that aren't gathered at all if you're not careful about what you're doing. Once the gathers were to my liking, I stitched a really quick running stitch to keep everything in place before I put it in the machine. I then stitched the two tiers together, guiding it through the machine very carefully to avoid messing up the gathers I had pinned earlier. Those times when I stop and lift the presser foot up are when I can see it smooshing the gathers in a way I don't like. So now we have the first two tiers done. It's already giving the petticoat a lot of body, and we can now move on to the ruffle. First, I sewed the side seams of the 8 panels of the ruffle together to make an even bigger circle than the second tier. Since it's a lot easier to do this part before sewing the bottom ruffle to the edge of the petticoat, I went ahead and hemmed the bottom of the ruffle by folding over the bottom edge twice. I then stitched some white lace at the bottom of the petticoat ruffle, and I also stitched some skinny gold ribbon over the edge of the lace. All of this was done before adding the ruffle to the rest of the petticoat. Once all of that was done, it was time to gather the ruffle. I guess at this point I had fixed the tension issues from earlier because this time I sewed a long basting stitch in the seam allowance of the top edge of the ruffle. Once again, I gave each panel its own basting stitch to make gathering a lot easier. I then gathered each panel so they fit evenly in the bottom edge of the second tier, and then I sewed the gathered top edge of the ruffle to the bottom edge of the second tier. After I added the 1-inch ribbon into the waistband for the drawstring, the petticoat was done. Thank you all so much for making it to the end of the petticoat video. This petticoat was a little bit more of a beast than I originally anticipated it being, but I think it turned out okay. I do want to exchange. I do have like a bright red ribbon instead of a more neutral ribbon, but like I don't think any never caused a problem before. So I'm gonna put the materials and the pattern that I used for this project in the description below, along with all of my socials. So I hope to see you guys next time. Like I said, we're going to be starting the actual main dress, which is super exciting. I try to post once a month here, but sometimes it's takes a little bit longer for these to get out because my jobs. So, but I really hope to see you all then. Have a nice day.